All righty. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Conversations, the last one of the 2021, 2020, oh, wait, no, 2020, 2021. I don't know what year it is anymore. My name is Rachel. It's been such a pleasure to have you all joining us online each week. It is our final one. I'm so excited to have Maira Liliestedt here with us. I'm going to be turning it over to her very soon. Just want to say a quick thank you to Faye A. Heston, who has been sponsoring us all season, making sure that these can happen for you even during this pandemic. And make sure to stay tuned for the 2021-2022 lecture series, which will be announced sometime this summer. So we look forward to seeing you all next year as well in person, as we all hope. So without further ado, I am going to stop sharing and I'm going to turn it over to Maira. Maira, whenever you are ready.
All right, let's see if I can manage the technology. Is that working?
Yes, it is.
Excellent. Okay, there we go.
Perfect.
Hello, everybody. So my task was to talk about the art of the soloist, and certainly the soloist can function many different ways, but I think because this was originally meant to be a talk that goes along with a concerto performance, I wanted to focus a little bit on concerto and how a soloist functions and what the orchestra's role is. So I thought I'd do a very brief history of the term. It dates back really to the early Baroque, and at times, either in the early Baroque or the late Baroque, the word concerto comes from either the Italian concertare, which means to reach agreement and bringing various vocal and instrumental forces together, or in late Baroque, the Latin concertare seemed to give rise to the concerto term, and that means to pit against. So we have at various times in history the concerto either bringing people together or pitting them against each other, and there's certainly more agreement in some concertos between a soloist and orchestra than in others, but that's where the term itself comes from. In the Baroque, in its beginnings, there were three types of instrumental concertos. The orchestral one, which actually features the whole orchestra, or the tutti, and we really would think of this more as a symphony today, I think, but they had an orchestral concerto. It was a short-lived genre, only about 40 years or so at the end of the Baroque. They also had a concerto grosso, which featured a small group of instruments called a concertino against the tutti, and also a short-lived genre, really only survived through the end of the Baroque era. But it's that third type of concerto, the solo concerto, that we're most used to today. We have a solo instrument featured against the whole orchestra, or the tutti. The tutti comes from the Italian word all, so everyone's playing. This solo concerto is the genre that's still popular today. It has survived through the classical and the Romantic era, contemporary era, and certainly still a popular one to be composed by living composers. So let's start briefly with the Baroque era. Vivaldi composed hundreds of concertos. He is probably the very first one to focus on the soloist in the concerto and show a great deal of virtuosic demand for those soloists. So when we go to hear a concerto performance, we certainly all look forward to the wonderful pyrotechnics that can come out of wonderful playing of soloists, or perhaps we have a terrific singer who is going to have excellent flexibility. Those kinds of virtuosic tendencies to show off the soloist really started with Vivaldi's works. He really gives a lot of technical work to the soloists to set them apart from what was demanded of the orchestra. He is probably most famous for his four seasons. We probably haven't really thought of them as concertos, but they definitely are. So let me play our beloved Spring Concerto, the very beginning of which features about 30 seconds of the tutti, so the entire orchestra, and then we'll see a solo violin interacting with a couple other violins, so most of the orchestra drops out, allowing the featured soloists to come through. That's the famous bird part. And then we hear the whole orchestra, the tutti, coming back again with the refrain material. So just a quick taste of this. Let me make sure that we don't hear ads. I apologize. I will try to keep us from hearing ads on YouTube. Here's our solo passage. Many trills, more virtuosic demands of the soloists. And our whole ensemble is about ready to join in. Here's our toot. There's our Baroque example. Let's move on to the classical concerto. And in the classical era, roughly 1750 to 1820, the solo concerto really standardizes in 3 movements. Generally, we have a fast, slow, and fast movement. And the first movement is in what we call sonata form. Sonata form is in 3 main sections: the exposition, the development, and the recapitulation. The exposition literally exposes us to the themes or introduces the main musical ideas of the movement. And then the development literally develops them. We might have the musical themes fragmented or put in different keys, or maybe the accompaniment is slightly changed, or rhythmic figures are slightly changed. Usually the development is the point of climax. There's turmoil, there's instability, and the recapitulation, coming from the word to recapitulate, which has a Latin root meaning to review. So that the recapitulation third section literally brings us back to those initial themes from the exposition. So it feels very much like a trip that has concluded, that we've come back home, and that we have now returned to the home key as well. The only difference between sonata and concerto form is that in concertos, the standard had become that we would get the exposition twice. So the first exposition was for the orchestra alone, and the second exposition following right after that would also include the soloist. We have one other tweak. In a concerto, we have, towards the very end of the recapitulation, a cadenza. And the cadenza is meant to feature the soloist alone. And this is the part where the orchestra drops out and the soloist gets a chance to show skills, technical ability. And often the cadenza features another small development of the main motives of the movement. So that first movement of a concerto in the classical era features those 3 points. And I'd like for us to go briefly to a couple of the important ones so that we see what the standard was. Let me play some snippets from Mozart's Concerto in D minor. And we'll start with the orchestral exposition. Too many buttons. Come on.
And as a reminder for those of you who are just now joining, feel free to put any questions you have in the chat as we go along, and I will make sure to answer them.
Good grammar and spelling are important, but if you want to write essays that inspire.
This performance is of Mitsuko Uchida, who is a well-known Mozart interpreter, and she does something in this performance that is particularly true to the time period. She also conducts. And there's no separate conductor. She conducts from the keyboard, and that was the practice of the time. So this is the orchestral exposition. Let's hear briefly the soloist joining in for the second exposition. While the soloist does something different musically, the orchestra coming in very soon will go back to that same opening theme that we heard from the orchestral exposition. Let's briefly hop over towards the end of this first movement where the soloist gets to play a cadenza. So this is the part where the soloist gets to be featured. In the classical era, as when Mozart wrote this piece, these would have been improvised on the spot. Performers were expected to know how to improvise, and so a lot of performers would have just made this up on the spot. Many Mozart concertos do not have a cadenza written by the composer because he would have improvised them. He did leave a written cadenza for this concerto, so what we hear here is the one that Mozart had composed. This is the problem with a presentation that includes music. You always have to cut it off somewhere. I hate that part. But for the sake of time, let's move on to the second movement. So the second movement of this concerto is very typical of the classical concerto in the fact that it's a nice, slow movement, very lyrical, oftentimes influenced by opera arias and the beautiful melodies that would have been sung by those operatic soloists. So this is our second movement in the Mozart. Skipping the ads, hold on.
Over the last 2 months, I've lost about 20 pounds, which blows my mind.
After 3 months, I've actually lost a little over.
Dialogue with the orchestra. third movement of a classical concerto had standardized as a cheerful, fast movement, oftentimes meant to send the audience home in a good mood, really. But oftentimes the rondo third movement implied an A section that would return several times, alternating with contrasting material. So while the third movement of this piece is not as cheerful because it's in minor, it certainly has a burst of energy to send people home in very high spirits. So let's just listen to the beginning of the third movement of this Mozart concerto. Good place to stop those ever. So we have standardized this three movement form, and the very next thing that we have going on is Mr. Mozart, or Mr. Beethoven. Mr. Beethoven was definitely a trendsetter, we all know that. He certainly revolutionized a lot of trends, but one way that he affects the concerto is by starting to depart from that standard form that we just got familiar with in Mozart. One way that I can show you is the beginning of his fifth piano concerto is nicknamed the Emperor. So we have learned that the first movement of the concerto in the classical era should start with an orchestral exposition, and that the cadenza that features just the soloist is at the end of the first movement. And then Beethoven does not do that at all. And one of the reasons that Beethoven does not do that at all is because Beethoven used classical forms to push the boundaries. Perhaps even his life in general was an example of the fact that he went against the grain. And so here, instead of respecting that traditional form that we have now been used to for a couple of generations, he does something completely different.
Meet your next pillow. Why do we make our pillow in the shape of a cube? I'll tell you. The problem with pillows is that you're trying.
Some high quality names here for us. Christian Zimmerman at the piano and Mr. Bernstein, conductor. So, orchestral exposition we're expecting. Or not, we just get a cadenza. Maybe now? Nope, another cadenza. Now? Nope. Third cadenza. Now we get the orchestral exposition. And as we probably all already know, Beethoven was one that almost single-handedly pushed music into the Romantic era, perhaps with his incredible expression of individual emotion in music. So we're transitioning from an era that had been music for a purpose, music for functions, and music was often discarded after being first performed in the Baroque era, Classical era, very similar. A lot of composers were in the employ of some church or some aristocratic families. They had to write for certain occasions. In the Romantic era, we've transitioned to music being written as an emotional expression of the composer. They viewed music as something that would be a picture of the composer's soul. And it's really Beethoven's emotional expression in his middle period in pieces like the Emperor Concerto that moved us into the Romantic era, into the 19th century. So in the 19th century then, if individual expression was held so in such high esteem, originality, individuality was also much prized. And one way that composers showed that originality was to continue to push the standards, the limits of what was thought to be normal. We see many composers in the 19th century writing concertos, but I just picked a few so that we can have an idea. Some of the conservatives were Chopin and Grieg. We see concerto in 3 movements, like we have seen from Mozart. We see first movements in sonata form, like we have seen from Mozart. But even these composers who keep the form standard are often very daring with their chromatic harmonies, adding a lot more spice and individuality to their music that way. Let me point to Franz Liszt, though, briefly, because not only did he have chromatic spice in his harmonies, he really revolutionized form as well. Liszt, first concerto, for example, is 4 movements in one. They are continuous, about 15-minute brief piece, but themes from the early part of the concerto are used and come back again in various guises throughout the whole piece. So even though it feels like 4 continuous movements with their different characteristics, the music of the opening is brought back in different guises. And I'd like to show you several of those spots. This kind of transformation is literally called thematic transformation. And Liszt was known for his thematic transformation. He would take a theme as this first theme, and he would put it in very different context, different mood, different tempo, so that we hear it in a completely different angle than the beginning. So the opening theme might be familiar to us because it has been used in popular culture in the Smurfs, and Gargamel's theme is what starts in a very devilish fashion. And the pianist joins in. Notice again that we have no orchestral exposition. The pianist joins in a few seconds in, so we are moving away from that standard form. Let's listen to our dum ba dum bum bum ba bum theme, quite transformed into a much more mysterious statement later on in the piece. And the orchestra coming up. Much more subdued, tense. And he uses this theme throughout in various guises, thematic transformation. But the very end of the piece is a thundering finale on that particular theme. So let's hear Martha Argerich at her best. At least we got to hear an end of something. The solo concerto has survived into the modern era and it has continued to be popular. Let me point to just a couple of examples. Mr. Prokofiev lived to 1953. Interestingly enough, for those of you that might not know, he died not just the same day, but during the same hour as dictator Stalin. Very unusual little trivia fact. But Prokofiev was a fantastic pianist. He was known for his music. He was known as a pianist to program on his recitals only music of Prokofiev, had quite a healthy ego, wrote not one, but 2 autobiographies of his life. In any case, it is terrific music. So his 3rd piano concerto is probably his most beloved. It does have some classical features. The first movement is in sonata form, as we had seen in Mozart time. He also inherits from the 19th century. The music is incredibly lush at times, as the very opening of that first movement that I will play. And then on the flip side, there are incredibly dissonant spots. He was known to use the piano very percussively, a lot of dissonance. He wrote some pieces during the Second World War that were called the War Sonatas, and they are very angry while also exploring the beauty of the human soul. So those 2 extremes, and a lot of those kinds of characteristics show up in this piece as well. So let me show you the very opening of the first movement that encapsulates a lot of those characteristics in a very little chunk.
Life on the farm is kind of laid back. Ain't much an old country boy like me can't hack. Early to rise, early in the sack. I thank God I'm a country boy. Well, a simple kind of life never did me no harm. Thank God I'm a country boy.
Here's our opening, quite beautifully lush, very romantic in character, though a little more dissonant than what we'd have seen in the 19th century. This section also shows us something that has grown through the 19th and 20th centuries, and that's the involvement of the orchestra. He was a great pianist. Here's some great pianism. Very well written for the capabilities of the instrument. Here's our warlike section, very percussive. Then in the 20th century, we also had a little different spin. Some other musical characteristics started to influence the traditional concerto. So we have people like George Gershwin and jazz in Rhapsody in Blue. Gershwin was quite a good pianist too, so the writing here is also quite idiomatic, quite well suited to the instrument. But definitely we have a powerful jazz influence from the famous beginning clarinet opening to a lot of the passages, even for the soloist. Oh, oh. Forgot the sound. One of the many cadenzas, very flashy writing. I'm smiling because at that lovely spot right before the orchestra comes in, the conductor tried to get the orchestra to say, ah, before they came in. And I convinced him not to have them do that. But it is such a lovely spot. It is certainly worthy. I have to agree with him on that. The genre is still very popular. I just gave one example of Lowell Lieberman, who's a composer that is an American living composer born in '61. He's written 3 piano concertos, one of the most performed living composers. So that genre is alive and well. We are still very much enjoying concerto with orchestra. So let me talk a little bit about the peculiarities of playing with an orchestra. I have some good things and some bad things and some idiomatic things that fit the orchestra and the soloist. So the good things are very obvious, I think. There's a great lush sound. That collaboration between ensemble and soloist is really magnificent. The blend of timbres and the intricate musical dialogue that can happen because of the presence of the soloist and the orchestra are really quite wonderful. I'd like to play an example from Sasson's second piano concerto in G minor. This is Mr. Rubinstein. And listen to how quickly the orchestra and the pianist have to respond to each other. It is thrilling and a little scary at the same time. And that kind of writing is really all across the concerto literature. Really wonderful stuff that you don't really get to do by yourself. A lot of the concerto features some of the 19th century romantic ideals, and they had very extreme opposites in their ideals. One of them was their love for intimacy, perhaps that idea of individual emotion. And some of the concerto literature from the 19th century is really quite intimate, probably akin to the solo piano music that they loved so much, or the art song for just a solo voice and piano. So let me just play a short snippet from the second movement of Chopin's first concerto, and it really sounds like a nocturne, like one of his famous nocturnes. On the other extreme, we have grand orchestral statements, and these larger than life orchestral statements are akin to what we would have seen from the large orchestras in the symphonies of the late Romantics, of Brahms, of Mahler. And we get that in the concerto literature as well. One of the most famous spots that always deserves to be heard is the opening of the Tchaikovsky First Piano Concerto that really focuses on the orchestra. I always feel almost superhuman hearing music like this. It just gives us wings, I think, one of the beauties of what we do. So let's flip over some things that are not so good. One of them is logistics. It's just very short rehearsal time. And the orchestra and the soloist really are mutually dependent in a lot of spots. So to have maybe a Friday rehearsal and a Saturday afternoon rehearsal and Saturday evening it's showtime is really quite constricting, not just to the comfort level of the performers, but also to the ability of the orchestra, conductor, and soloist to put together a cohesive interpretation. So let's take a look at Rachmaninoff's spot where we have very much mutual dependent orchestra and soloist. And if it works, it's glorious. And if it doesn't work because of short rehearsal time, it's quite tricky. This is Yevgeny Kissin. In the third movement, there's a particularly intensive spot that blossoms into a little fugue where both the orchestra and the pianist are quite involved. Better not miss a beat there, literally. The exchanges are quite quick, but it is quite exciting. Something difficult to put together in a short rehearsal time, but luckily for that concerto, it's very well known, both the soloists and orchestras. So we have a good chance of having success. The other thing that can be difficult is there has to be interpretive compromise. Sometimes the tempo the soloist would want is not playable by the orchestra, or sometimes what the conductor might want is not playable by the soloist, or they both have their own very different ideas. So I'll show you one spot from the Rhapsody in Blue, and I'm sure that Eric Benjamin will not mind. This was definitely his tempo choice, not mine. I would have taken it much faster, but he wanted to milk it, and it worked. He was also the one that wanted the orchestra to say ah, so I guess I can't be terribly surprised. Another one, I won't mention names, but there's a very famous current international star pianist in a very famous video of the conductor literally mouthing the words "slow down" in the performance. So sometimes that interaction can be difficult. Let's talk about the things that are idiomatic, though, things that are peculiar to concerto playing. The other spin on idiomatic is that much concerto music is really idiomatic or well written for the abilities of the instrument. A lot of romantic concertos have a great deal of octaves, double fourths, tremolos, in string literature, double stops, what have you, things that showcase each instrument really, really well. Let's take a look at a sparkling passage in Liszt's first piano concerto. And one of the things that is particularly interesting about this spot is the fact that the opening of this excerpt features many quick repeated notes. And that was something that Liszt was particularly known for. Quick repeated notes like that had been practically unknown before Liszt came to the fore. And inspired by Paganini, Liszt wanted to push the boundaries of the piano as an instrument and do things on it that no one had ever done before, just like what Paganini had done for the violin. So let's watch some of those idiomatic passages. Then I must put this in. Hopefully I'm a first. But all of these passages, like this little sample of a score that I put in here, are quite tricky. If we look at them first, we might get dizzy. And then if we look at them a second and we realize, oh, this is just a C minor arpeggio and then a G minor arpeggio. And we think, I have practiced my scales and arpeggios. Then we might feel a little bit better about life. And that's indeed why we practice our scales and arpeggios. Indeed.
Mama, he did it again.
Now, Berlioz, now please, darling, settle down and play me your pretty little song.
Yes, Mama. Do me so do so me do. Every truly cultured music student knows you must learn your scales and your arpeggios. Bring the music ringing from your chest and not your nose, while you sing your scales and your arpeggios. If you're faithful to your daily practicing, you will find your progress is encouraging. Do me, so me, follow so it goes. When you do your scales and your arpeggios. Do me, so do.
So we practice our scales and our arpeggios, and then we can play Sasson second, which this passage is from. And so let's actually see Arthur Rubinstein play his scales and arpeggios. passage. You can certainly play his scales and arpeggios. It looks like that, and he did it quite beautifully, but it really only amounts to C minor and then G minor arpeggio. That interpretive compromise between the soloist and conductor is very interesting. I want to just play two short clips of Rachmaninoff's second, the opening of the first movement, where the wonderful cello melody comes in. And Sviatoslav Richter is the first example I have for you. And his tempo is very different, much slower than a lot of musicians take these days, but it is absolutely phenomenally rich, I think. Then we'll compare it with something of Yevgeny Kissin and note the difference.
I didn't realize how many mistakes I was making in English until I started to use Grammarly.
It's like having a proofreader and an English.
Significantly different, and sometimes it's the orchestra or the soloist wanting a very different view, but certainly a lot of learning and enriching can happen on both parts from such exchanges between the orchestra and the soloist. Certainly, the collaboration is important. So in that short rehearsal time, we want to make sure that we discuss those places that are particularly important. What tempo do you want here? How much time will you take at this cadence? Things like that. I just want to briefly play a short passage for you where the melody in the piano is so rich, we really don't want to rush it. And that's something we can talk through. So this is the second movement or second theme of the Chopin first. And at this point, the orchestra has a 3 and a 1, but the pianist probably wants to take some time at that cadence because it's such a lovely alto line. It didn't work. Just trucking through it. So we talk about it. And we love that spot a little bit more. So that collaboration and that rehearsal time is crucial in getting such musical ideas out there. Certainly must be a leader as a soloist. You want to have very clear rhythmic playing so the conductor can follow, the orchestra can follow, and that melodic voicing of just showing what you want to do is something that certainly we need to know. When to follow the conductor? The soloist needs to know that they're not always in control, and this is a spot that's the case. I think particularly setting tempos of new sections where the orchestra is in command is something where the soloist needs to pay attention. This is just one simple example from the Rhapsody in Blue, where we have finished one section and are about to launch into something else, and better pay attention because the conductor is going to set it. And then just knowing when to yield the spotlight. The soloist should know when to give way. So that opening cello melody from the Rachmaninoff Second Concerto that we heard both from Richter and from Kissin. Who cares that the pianist is thundering along? Really, it should be that gorgeous cello melody coming through. And my very last example is probably of my favorite spot where the soloist really should just give way. Even though they are playing wonderfully heroic stuff, the orchestra is so much more important in my opinion and should be featured. Climax of the first movement of Rachmaninoff's Second. My last example.
Feels weird picking it up. The legacy of the
And it's because of spots like that and the enriching that could happen musically on both sides that I think playing a concerto is not the art of the soloist, but an art including the soloist. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. I think it was wonderful to be able to listen to all that music. I know we're running a little short on time, but just one question that I got is, you yourself are a pianist, as we got to see many times. So maybe can you share personally for you, what is the most fulfilling thing to do when playing a solo, or maybe like a piece that fulfills you the most as a performer and a musician?
So my favorite piece of music is the Chopin First Piano Concerto, and the one I demonstrated a couple of times, and there are plans to play that this fall. But I think in a concerto setting, so many of these pieces are incredibly expressive, and we come to love one or another and relate to one or another very well. But then the actual playing with the orchestra seems to complete the picture. So playing solo is often a very lonely thing, and there's only so much you can do with even the wonderful tones of the piano that I love. So to complete that picture with the sound tapestry of the orchestra and those musical ideas of the conductor and the orchestra, it really brings more colors and more angles to playing that beloved piece.
Yeah. And then just one last thing, do you have any advice for how to effectively listen to a piece of music that's a full orchestra and a soloist? Because sometimes it can be full of a lot of things going on. So do you have any advice for the audience members who are listening about what to listen for, how to listen so that you can enjoy it the best?
I think most composers do a really nice job of introducing musical ideas and important melodies in a very clear way. So when there's a theme in the orchestra and it's really important, it'll really just soar along. And if we try to absorb those important moments and then follow them along as if we're meeting a long lost friend later on in the piece, then we're more likely to understand the structure and feel more connected to the piece. So I think if we just pay attention to those moments that the composer really seems to be showcasing a melody, either in the solo or the orchestra, and then see how it comes back and it interacts between the parts, I think it'll be more of an enriching experience.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you all of you who are here listening. This will be available to watch on YouTube. But thank you all so much. And we will see you next year for our next season of lectures.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.